Planning events is programming, and that is not new. Coding used to refer more to the process of finding the right language to describe the verbs of what was going to happen. It is kind of interesting to reflect on the contexts of determinism. The point of this video is that it is possible to pair program in different contexts. Like you can plan to program with someone, and you can also plan an event per week. One of the advantages of going live on TikTok consistently is that you can have that context kind of speak for itself. In college, I worked for the dorm as a program advisor. I ran a few clubs and helped other students start their own. In a separate thread, I founded a registered student organization, an RSO. That was called Student Body for Meaningful Education. The concept was to be more like a decentralized version of student council. We had 3 committees: discussion, connection, and creation. Something that stood out from my time as a program advisor were the guests in residence. Something was the guest in residence program. Some things were. They weren't things. Guests are guests things. The guests were people. We had an established professional artist come and describe basically how they related to their profession. That was helpful because they had actual artistic relationships, and that was a guiding factor in some of mine as I developed as an artist in my earlier career. People who choose art as a profession need to have a stable relationship with an ecosystem anyway, and entrepreneurship sometimes encourages unhealthy relationships to ecosystems. So I appreciate the guests in residence for being able to describe how they've consistently related to a variety of spaces in a mentorship capacity for days. The guests would stay for 1 or 2 weeks. Something that I appreciated about that role as well was working on Allen Notes, which were weekly publications just describing what was going on in a fun way. Which clubs were going on, where they were happening, what time. And that was a cool way to consider the organization structure of the hall in a decentralized capacity, because everyone had their own vision for their own clubs, and sometimes there were harmonies. So reflecting on what that felt like, and the holidays, and the ones that we celebrated, and the ones that I learned about, was like, that was a really cool experience. So when we describe programs, when we describe the thing that we're trying to do as a group of people or as individuals, and we say, we're going to set this time aside and have a discussion about this topic per week, or we're going to write for this amount of time or draw for this amount of time, what is that like? What does it produce? What is the return value of the program? And it doesn't need to be material. Though now that we can generate programs, we can generate scripts with ChatGPT, Codex, or Claude Code, what does it feel like to actually integrate with these concepts further? So there will be software engineering, and we can dissect that role into a variety of tasks like programming and relate to the plane of implementation, the plane of reality, the plane of experience. When we create these structures and we say, this is what's going to happen every thousands of times per minute or hundreds of times per day, because it's running a lot, it's a very fast loop, or a lot of people have this program downloaded. When we have the concept of job applications and application development, and people are building interfaces to describe their story and the reasons why they particularly have a skill in a context and why they want to relate to the people around them. When I went to college, I was curious how transistors worked and studied power in a context that I didn't appreciate as much as I can now. Though I knew that, I acknowledged that I didn't appreciate it as much as I wanted to because I had to work and establish my identity as a person having relationships with other people on my own terms, basically. Well, for the first time, in some ways, and that, ooh, some of those early relationships make me cringe to reflect on my like how I approached them, which is kind of funny to think about. Didn't expect that in this video. Others have lasted for a while, and I appreciate being able to have conversations with many people over longer contexts. And I look forward to that into adulthood. And that is a goal of employment. Employment in a different capacity, because I do have a role in a different context now. I'm describing this. Someone else can follow my journey. Someone else can read the code on my GitHub profile and see what I was focused on in my earlier career and what I've been focused on recently, and ask a language model to summarize those. So that is available. Someone with $20, a new developer with $20 can ask ChatGPT to do deep research, whatever, on a variety of topics now. And if I post this video to YouTube, Gemini can summarize this video and provide pointers for aspiring developers. So considering what development is and why we would do it and what it means to share that journey, it can be rewarding and it can also be somewhat exhausting. I appreciate the context of considering what software engineering actually is, like the problem solving aspect, and being able to have conversations with experienced engineers over decades now. And I also appreciate having had experiences in an academic environment where I could consider the reasons why we interact with microeconomic structures. One of my first web development jobs was working for the University of Illinois Extension as a web developer, and I remember being so adamant about implementing a particular PHP framework, and it turns out where I wanted to implement it was just not the right place, and there were other structures that I was able to implement. So I really appreciate that the team lead was patient for my passion and worked with me to find a way to implement that kind of focus. And this concept is an extension of my last video, which is effectively find a way to tell people the story of why you specifically have the skills that you specifically have. I wondered how transistors worked, and I wondered about that in ways that taught me a lot about motivation. I thought that I wanted to be a good programmer and learned about programming as more than just code. And software engineering, learning about that through the context of electrical and computer engineering was actually a good idea. I appreciate that I wondered more and wondered about the reasons about instruction, wondered about the structures and formations and strategies. Ultimately, my major was learning and education studies with a concentration in applied learning science. I dropped out. I'm not actually sure if that was my official major. Reflecting on the actually that time in my life, I'm curious. I don't have a degree, and I did drop out, but 9 minutes into this video, how relevant is me dropping out relative to the other details? And also, how do I relate to detail? Ideally, I would grow and move forward and exist in an environment that allows me to grow and move forward, and that is what I hope to bring. I hope to build a world that makes that more available. Some feedback that I received at a job that I lost, I wasn't there for very long, was that I didn't communicate like a senior engineer, and that stuck with me because I wasn't sure how senior engineers specifically communicated. And since I've been trying to mentor new developers into software engineering as a discipline, I recognize that there are different layers of narrative that are more accessible. How do I say that? Old people telling stories is a pretty useful dimension of society. I appreciate that. I appreciate that I've been able to have conversations with some old people, drawing with peeps. For a while after I got fired, I would draw with people, and I thought a lot about what would make that the easiest thing to do consistently. And I tried a few different utensils like ballpoint pens, which worked pretty well. I tried watercolor sets, like the kind that you can take pretty much anywhere. I'm curious about bars providing those because that was actually a decent tactile thing to do, and watercolor was easy to clean up. But in that time, I had conversations with some older people, and I reflected on what made those conversations feel so meaningful. And it often was the story they told and the ways they were able to relate to generally, well, the ones that I had conversations with. So I'm not saying that seniors necessarily always have a solid, coherent story to tell, though when I reflect on what it means to communicate like a senior engineer, I mean, I've mentored people and reflected on what's successful. And also, I have conversations with other engineers who have similar amounts of experience. I've been practicing making longer form videos, and it has taken an amount of warm up, which has been difficult, and, etc. This is promo for lore.land. Currently, the site hasn't been updated in a while, and I don't mind that because I'm describing why that would be the case. It's because there's a TikTok, and there are people who have seen different dimensions of storytelling, different ways that have related to the publication process, to Kickstarter, to TikTok promo, to YouTube videos, Midjourney, in describing the reasons why we relate to media and the cool things about it. I'm practicing telling stories and I'm reflecting on how this will fit on TikTok and YouTube. Some people who are looking forward to lore.land receiving updates will look forward more, maybe, to lore.land receiving updates. I have a lot of author friends, so I'm inviting them to consider maybe you can post stories on your website and tease them. That's a pretty decent reason to learn code. HTML and CSS you can code by hand, and also there are language models that you can code with. There's autocomplete and generative AI, so if you want to do either approach to creating code, those are tools available to you. I do recommend coding with Vim and exploring NeoVim eventually, and the reason I recommend that is so you actually, you can appreciate a slower pace of development and what it feels like to look forward to updates and some of the ergonomics, and exercise your mind about remembering syntax and have the ninja feeling of bouncing around the keyboard. And then beyond that, there are millions of people who have been programming for years and relating to a change in pace, in language, and the reasons why we exchange structure is likely going to happen gradually in a variety of sectors. So we can learn web languages, we can study web content accessibility guidelines, and we can build structures that make intergenerational media literacy more accessible. And with that, new storytelling methods are emerging. We can post links to images and have those be seeds for Midjourney prompts, and Grok Imagine is developing pretty interestingly. Nano Banana 2 is a pretty powerful image editor. Photoshop can do some pretty cool, pretty fun, esoteric, weird things with AI. I generally appreciate Photoshop for its filters and templates because it makes some media more palatable to interact with, easier to read, and when there are things that I care about, I can accentuate that I'm trying to make them more readable when I do that. Theoretically, I can ask ChatGPT to generate an image, but if I'm generating a lot of content, the contexts of the aesthetics being categorizable by my audience is helpful and somewhat necessary because there's an amount of fatigue that can go into discerning how much to care about AI. Concept is that I'm practicing making videos for forward deployed engineering roles, could be founding engineer roles, founding engineer roles, principal engineering roles work too, senior software engineering roles, director of communications, director of technology. Posted a whole bunch on my LinkedIn, YouTube, TikTok, GitHub, X. Gonna generate some songs with Suno. I have generated a whole bunch of images with Midjourney, probably like 8 or 9,000. I was one of the earliest subscribers to ChatGPT. Been developing the workbench with Claude Code and Codex, GPT Codex, different versions of both Claude and Codex, different versions of Claude Code and Codex, Opus, and GPT. I appreciated anti-gravity for a while, and I'm excited to explore that more when I have some amount of funding. Honestly, $400 would go a long way for describing a chapter of development. I'm kind of hoping somebody hears that and is interested in building networking connections, because if I'm describing principal engineering roles and there's a software engineer out there who believes they can start to build structures similar to the ones that I've been investing in, if I'm saying $400 would go a long way towards development, I can describe that in software engineering language, and it might be useful to someone else who is building concurrently. The advantage of getting started earlier is that you have the things, and if you want to update them daily, then you can. There are videos that I can look back on that I posted a year ago today on TikTok. So someone who's on the fence about using my services can look back on things that I posted years ago, and they can clone repositories that I've made available on GitHub and I've talked about on YouTube and described on LinkedIn. So in the context of building ecosystems and cinematic universes and genres, defining the reasons why people might engage with creator ecosystems and collaborative entertainment, towards intergenerational media literacy. How about that?